It was a sham. I mean, 88% of the vote. That takes me back to when Saddam Hussein got 100% of the vote in a referendum on his leadership in 2002. It's that kind of territory. Not one candidate reached 5% other than Vladimir Putin. And there are many layers to the illegitimacy of the voting processes in this presidential election. For the first thing, anyone who is a major political threat to Vladimir Putin either ends up dead, in jail, or disqualified from the ballot paper. And we saw that in the case of Boris Nadezhdin, who I interviewed last month. He was the anti-war prospective candidate. He collected 100,000 signatures, as you need to get, but about 10% of them were rubbed out by the Central Election Commission, which is, of course, controlled by the Kremlin. This has happened previously as well. In the last election, they would not let Navalny run. Previously, former Prime Minister Kasyanov couldn't run either in another election. So anyone who is a major threat simply cannot get on the ballot paper. While we were in Vilnius, we spoke to Roman Udot, and he was part of an independent monitoring group, Golos. You mentioned Lord Cameron talked about them not having independent monitoring. The co-chair of that group, Golos, is in prison in Russia at the moment. Roman Udot showed us, within hours of the polls opening, evidence of ballot box stacking going on. He also had major concerns about a couple of initiatives at this election. One was electronic voting, which came in 29 regions, and he was really concerned that that would lead to manipulation of the vote. Also, he was concerned about the 3 days of voting, because he showed us video evidence going back to the 2021 Duma elections, where ballot boxes were tampered with overnight, and it was captured on CCTV inside these polling stations. So he believed that that was going to happen again. And so, yeah, there were major concerns on so many levels about this election. And also add to that the fact that voting was taking place on occupied territory inside Ukraine that has been illegally annexed by Russia. Once again undermining the credibility of this election. So that is why you're hearing these kind of comments from Lord Cameron, from the White House, and I expect you'll hear more comments in the coming days about the legitimacy of this election.
Yeah, but the reality is Putin is back for another 6 years, and how will global leaders and, I guess, people manage to challenge the legitimacy of his leadership going forward?
Well, this is what is going to be really interesting to watch in the coming days. Of course, Putin's great mate, Lukashenko in Belarus, he has been declared illegitimate by many Western nations, and there will be a push on from many in the opposition in Russia. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who of course is in prison in Siberia at the moment for treason, 25 years in jail for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in the past week saying that Western leaders need to come out and declare that Putin is illegitimate as leader. Not just that the election was illegitimate, that he is illegitimate as leader. So it will be very interesting to see if countries like Lithuania, like Poland, like Estonia, that they may even come out and say this kind of thing about President Putin. So I think that is worth watching in the coming days about whether people heed that call from Vladimir Kara-Murza, and also Yulia Navalny, who's come out and said something similar in recent days, that it's time to say that about President Putin.
Yeah. Steve, there was a sort of silent protest, if you want, a civilian protest as the election played out, wasn't there?
That's right. So where I'm standing at the moment is Boris Nemtsov Park, named after the assassinated former Russian opposition politician who was killed on the bridge near the Kremlin in 2015. And behind me is the Russian embassy here in Vilnius. And we were there yesterday and we saw these huge queues snaking around the corner. And what had happened was that a politician from St. Petersburg who now lives in Vilnius called Maxim Resnick called on this idea for noon against Putin, and the idea that voters flood the polling station at midday to show that they're opposed to Putin, both as a leader but also his war in Ukraine. And it was an idea that was taken up by Navalny before he died in custody last month. He said he thought it was a really good idea. And many opposition Russian figures called on this to happen both inside the country and outside the country at polling stations like the one behind me in the Russian embassy. And that certainly went on. And the idea, of course, is that how do you arrest somebody for turning up to vote at midday? They could have just done it by accident. In a country where any political opposition or speaking out is criminalised, it felt like to all those people like the only thing they could do. And when I was outside the embassy yesterday, at 12:30, I counted at least 300 people in that queue. And we saw very large queues in cities like Berlin, similarly in Armenia as well, in London, as they were queuing up to vote. But also in Moscow, there were definitely queues in Moscow. And I was just talking to a former deputy minister who worked under Putin, and he said that he thought it was really significant how many people turned up. And I spoke to people who used to work with Navalny yesterday, and they were quite buoyed by the amount of people who turned up here and in other cities to show their form of protest against President Putin.
Yeah, and of course the shadow of Navalny's death actually continues to hang over this election, and even Putin unexpectedly even addressed it, which he hasn't done so far.
He mentioned Navalny 3 times in that post-election speech. I can't ever remember him mentioning Navalny's name. It's like he didn't want to give him oxygen. It was like he didn't want to acknowledge the guy who was the biggest threat to him politically. When he did mention him, he seemed to confirm something that we'd heard in the media from a member of the Navalny team, that there were negotiations going on to get Navalny released in some kind of prisoner swap deal. He said that he agreed to that. He also said then what happened happened. In other words, that Navalny died. And then he seemed to draw some kind of comparison to what happens in the US jail system where people die. Of course, we don't know of opposition figures dying in jail in the US, but he wanted to draw a comparison to that. So he did mention Navalny, and that was highly unusual. But of course, Navalny's team have come out since then and just said how disgusted they were by the comments. And so they're not very happy about them at all.
Yeah, exactly. I think his comment was life happens. Well, in fact, that is not the case when it comes to Alexei Navalny. Good to have you on, Steve. Appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth.